I live in Kiev, Ukraine. It has a homogeneous population, mostly Slavs. There are a lot of things I like about living in Kiev. I don't have to worry which neighborhood I live in. There are rich and poor neighborhoods, but crime is fairly evenly distributed. Kiev is a diverse society, but not the kind that would show up in a photograph. We have Ukrainians, Russians, Georgians, Tatars, Hungarians, Poles, and various other Europeans. There are also quite a few gypsies and the smatterings of Muslims from Central Asia. Now, the Jews in Ukraine have always kept themselves a bit more apart than Jews in the United States, and almost everybody speaks Ukrainian and Russian. Educated people have been exposed to several years of English as well. The average ones, young ones, will force foreigners over into English even if the foreigner has a better mastery of their language. Ukrainians want to practice. Gypsies aside, there's no element in society that is regarded as especially crime-prone. So, with the exception of the Jews and Gypsies, most elements within this diverse mix think of themselves as pretty much equal to one another. I don't have to worry about the police not doing their jobs, not that they do. They're not highly paid. They're not highly efficient at solving crimes. They don't do a very good job at controlling speeding. And parking enforcement is lax. They'd be puzzled and perplexed if anybody told them they should be bothering citizens for violating ordinances against burning leaves in the backyard, leaving soda pop bottles on the streets, or maintaining a dangerous nuisance such as a swing set in their yard. Police here aren't called on much to respond to domestic disturbances. They don't enforce restraining orders commanding men to stay away from their former wives or girlfriends. Still in all, you almost never see women with shiners or other signs of abuse in public, walking down the streets or on the bus. Spousal abuse certainly happens, but it's regarded as an issue to be settled within the family. It's true that most spousal abuse involves alcohol. The most common form that it takes is wives endlessly berating their husbands about how much they drink, and predictably some guys resent it and get physical from time to time. I don't particularly worry about walking down the street alone at night or walking through the park by myself. It's not that the police presence offers such a strong deterrent to crime. Rather, Ukrainian people themselves are not prone to violent crime, and they have a fairly healthy respect for one another. Violent crime here is seldom random. If a person gets killed, the odds are pretty good he could have told you why and by whom he got killed. The flip side is that if you don't anger the wrong people, you're pretty safe. Gay people are tolerated here the way they were in the San Francisco of my youth. Gays don't make an issue of it, and people don't bother them. Ukrainians use the toilets that correspond to how they're built below the belt line. If there are cross-dressers in this city of 4 million, and I have to assume that there are, they're at least discreet about it. I suspect that they use whatever bathroom they think they can get away with. Anyhow, the issue has never been something anybody discusses, and the police certainly don't get mixed up in questions of civil rights or morality. Even despite the war with Russia, Ukraine doesn't worry too much about security in public buildings. They have guards, don't look very effective to me, and the buildings are not the fortresses that one finds in the United States since a spate of embassy bombings overseas and the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing. Ukrainians couldn't afford to build fortresses, and they simply don't have people in the society who seem to pose that sort of a threat. The exception is political violence. Now, because the city administration buildings were not defended, the Russian proxies were able to take them over pretty easily in 2014. The surprise is not that they succeeded in cities like Donetsk and Luhansk, but that they failed in Kharkiv, Mariupol, Odessa, and so many other places. It's true, the Russians gained some victories over the untried and disoriented Ukrainian government, but it certainly wasn't as much as it might have been given the absolute laxity of the defenses. I've never heard about a school shooting here. It would be easy to do. The schools have no security at all. It's simply that most students feel a connection to their fellow Ukrainians and especially to their schools. A school shooting would just be unthinkable. Nobody is that alienated. I even have a good word put in about the graffiti here. There's quite a bit painted on the concrete walls that abut pathways connecting the public transit stops. Some of it is fairly high quality, though it's certainly not up to the standard of Britain's Banksy. And there are beautiful murals decorating the sides of buildings, some of them 20 and 30 stories high, but these have to have been done with permission. So, such graffiti as there is does not appear to be generally profane or gang-oriented. It's of a higher class than Western graffiti. Let me also put in a good word about loitering. People do gather in the parks in summer. Yes, it's often groups of young men with bottles of beer in their hands, and the old ladies are righteously indignant about the fact that they're not very careful where they strew the empty beer bottles. But the guys are usually discreet enough not to relieve themselves in public. The police would be all over them if that happened. The main thing is that the loiterers, while they may be a nuisance, don't seem to pose any danger to anybody. They don't make catcalls at passing women. And only occasionally do they have obnoxious boomboxes with them. And this calls for a note on Ukrainian popular music. It's not sophisticated, but I find it somewhat preferable to Western pop music. They have an equivalent of country music, something called chanson, from the French word for song. The usual beat is a thumping boom, 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 4/4. The melody usually sung in a raspy voice. The themes are universal: love, betrayal, loneliness. And they have the equivalent of rap music, which is rap music, but it's sung by Ukrainians. Now, I'm not much of an expert on rap, but it cannot be as degrading and profane as American rap music. And there are, of course, rude people here. Jerks come in all colors, even monochrome. Our jerks are not usually threatening, just unhappy, maladjusted people. But offsetting the relatively few jerks, you frequently witness spontaneous acts of kindness. There are a lot of old people. Strangers help each other on the bus all the time. I'm somewhat chagrined to find myself now numbered among the geriatric. Young men will offer me a hand as I get off the bus. I'm still fully capable, but I appreciate the gesture because I know there will come a time when I need it. Even the gypsies here aren't that bad. Their crimes, if any, are not violent, and they don't commit crimes at all in neighborhoods such as ours where they live. I have to appreciate the Ukrainians' apprehension about the gypsies. They know them much better than I do. But still, I have to admit, I've never seen them do anything untoward. In the summertime, there are people who play loud, throbbing music well into the night, particularly on Friday and Saturday. We wish they would tone it down. But I don't take it on myself to go out and talk to them. I don't feel I have to keep quiet out of fear, however. It's more out of a foreigner's reluctance to get mixed up in the affairs of local people. And besides that, I'm too lazy, and I don't think it would have much impact. Littering here is a problem. People leave bottles and trash all over the place. Most Ukrainians resent it as much as I do. My son's pretty good about cleaning up other people's messes. We have to carry our garbage to a dumpster about a quarter-mile away. Along the way, he'll usually pick up other people's trash. He doesn't even feel especially virtuous doing this. It's just what one does. People are not malicious in their littering. They may throw beer bottles on the roadside, but they don't throw them at oncoming cars. Nobody dumps heavy stones or bricks off the overpasses. Public safety is relatively minimal. If you wanted to be that antisocial, you could almost certainly get away with it. But that's precisely because almost nobody does. People like to claim that Ukraine has a major drug problem. I know lots of young people, and I don't even know any who will tell me that they have tried marijuana. I never smell it here. People write that needle drugs are an issue around the railroad stations in the middle of town. You occasionally see zonked out bums on the street, but they look more like alcoholics than druggies. I could be naive. At any rate, they're all white people and not violent. I have a strong conviction that the international do-gooder community exaggerates Ukraine's social problems for its own pecuniary benefit. If there are gangs, they're of the old-fashioned for-profit type, intent on victimizing society as a whole instead of rival gangs. There isn't nearly as much of the kind of identity around which a gang usually coalesces: ethnicity, nationality, localism, so on. And there isn't any evidence or talk about gang colors, gang wars, gang territory, and that kind of thing. Everybody except the well-to-do send their kids to neighborhood schools. And the teachers have fairly well-established expectations of the students, and they're not afraid to measure children by the government-imposed standards. There is no class of students that is considered academically slow. Gypsies do them the favor of avoiding school altogether. A teacher can thus afford to give an honest evaluation of students' performance without the fear that it will be thrown back in their face for some reason or another. Now, teachers are functionaries of the government, and people here have a long-standing respect for, perhaps a fear of the government. They don't tell the teachers how to do their jobs, and they generally appreciate what the teachers are doing to get their kids educated. Kiev has a beautiful metro system, started about 60 years ago. It boasts the deepest underground station of any metro in the world. It has 3 intersecting metro lines that run out to the city limits in 6 places, and there's a 4th under construction. It also has an extensive and highly effective system of public transportation: tramways, a funicular, regional electric train, electric buses, diesel buses, and a fleet of contractor-operated jitney buses. The drivers are not unionized. They're happy to have their jobs. The managers hire whom they want on the basis of competence, no other criterion, which means it's staffed entirely by Ukrainians, and it works. There has not been a strike since I've been here. Drivers are generally polite and almost never get into accidents. The maintenance staff must also be quite good. Although the fleet is old, one rarely sees a breakdown. The fare collection system would simply not work in a Western country. The conductor on the bus collects fares and hands out tickets to be validated using one of the ticket punches on the vertical supports that the passengers hang on to. A controller occasionally comes through the bus asking to see people's tickets. A rider without a ticket is subjected to a fine, fixed at 20 times the price of a ride. In rough numbers, a ride costs 20 cents, so the fine is $4. The system is incredibly low-tech. The conductor could skim money if she wanted. The passengers on a crowded bus could credibly claim that they tried to pay the conductor, they couldn't get to her. The odds would certainly favor not paying, but they do pay. Riders will pass money hand over hand over hand to the conductor and receive the ticket back hand over hand, along with any change. About half the ridership consists of students and people over 60. They ride for free. A controller would have a hard time if somebody boldly lied and said they were over 60. In other words, the whole system is based on trust, social capital. If people wanted to cheat, they could, but they don't. Now, riders cheat all the time in Western Europe. They manage to avoid paying for the buses. Turnstile jumpers are a fixture in the metros in Paris, London, Montreal, and other big Western cities. And the station attendants there don't want to excite the unpleasantness that would come from confronting these imported hooligans. So it goes on with impunity. The honest middle-class burghers paying the unreasonably high ticket prices on public transit who support the whole thing. In Kiev, you don't have to worry about complaining about breaches of etiquette. If a guy is manspreading on the bus or smells like urine, the old ladies aren't afraid to let him know that he's violating community standards. Any society depends more on custom than written laws, and it's the common people within that society who inform one another of the standards. Ukraine is a society in which people still uphold the standards. Turnstile jumping is only one manifestation of a lack of respect for society. The aforementioned big cities in the West also have flash mobs, smash and grab robberies, muggings, and a whole lot of other unpleasantness that generally doesn't go on in Kiev. Now, police here don't take much guff from the public. In a homogeneous society like this, nobody can claim discrimination. Put in other ways, the police can discriminate against whoever they want with impunity. And the courts are not terribly interested in civil rights issues. The upshot is that penny ante malefactors simply wouldn't get away with their nonsense here in Kiev. The station attendants, police, and other public transport users just wouldn't tolerate the kind of abuses that go on in the West. In Ukraine, you don't hear stories about road rage. The country simply doesn't have an infrastructure to support it. In more developed countries, there are endless superhighways along which densely packed cars can roll along side by side for miles at a time, bearing commuters back and forth from the centers of commerce to their isolated suburbs, far from the riffraff who populate the city centers. Invariably, there are antsy drivers who cut in and out, attempting to gain a few seconds that they can waste serving mammon in their workplace. In the process, they irk other drivers, driving too close and cutting them off. The anonymity that people enjoy within their steel boxes makes it easy to imagine the worst about their fellow drivers. But in Ukraine, people in the cities aren't too much different from people in the suburbs. There is no large network of divided highways. The best we seem to have are 4-lane highways, usually with a double line down the middle. We do have a higher rate of head-on crashes, but we don't have that much road rage. With nobody to discriminate against, Ukraine is not saddled with anti-discrimination laws. Businesses can hire whom they please. Nepotism is rampant. Businesses usually try to hire the boss's relatives. It's what's expected. You take care of your own. Not to do so would be kind of weird. The upshot is that employment law here is not a big deal. Employers have the freedom to do what they want. If an employee is unhappy, he can leave. On the subject of employment law, Ukraine has almost no labor unions to speak of. America's labor unions have been used first to enforce discrimination. The skilled trade unions of the old American Federation of Labor successfully excluded blacks, and later as vehicles of enforced integration. But here, without unions in the middle to muddy the waters, in Ukraine, a job is strictly a matter between employer and employee. Most people are happy just to have a job. Family considerations aside, employers are able to simply hire the best people for the job. That's one reason why the computer services sector is thriving here. There is no mandate that an employer take anything specific into consideration in making a hire. No groups enjoy government-dictated preference. Nobody is advocating that they need more of a certain type of person in the workplace. The entire focus is on getting the job done, pleasing the client. Kiev is divided up into administrative regions called rayons, more or less equivalent to wards in an American city. These are further broken up informally into neighborhoods, which seldom have defined boundaries. Just like everywhere in the world, the most prestigious neighborhoods are closest to the city center, closest to the water, and built on high ground. There aren't any restrictive covenants with regard to who can live where, and there aren't many ethnic neighborhoods to speak of. Mortgage lending is not nearly as well developed in Kiev as in the West. Lenders require a substantial down payment and relatively high monthly interest rates. Borrowers have a choice between two unattractive alternatives for a loan. If they borrow in the local currency, interest rates are high, over 10%. But if they borrow in foreign currency, they can get whipsawed by exchange rate fluctuations. Whatever the case, lenders make the decision based primarily on the borrower's income and collateral. Government doesn't force lenders to take non-financial factors into consideration. As a result of all of this, the level of private debt in Ukraine seems sustainable, because it's just harder to borrow beyond your means here. Ukrainians run their civil service more or less the way everybody else does. There are competitive examinations to get in, and people rise through the ranks based on their evaluations and, of course, on their connections. Some civil servants treat the public with the same indifference as bureaucrats everywhere else. However, it's almost always Ukrainians dealing with Ukrainians, and the fact that it's their own people seems to make a difference. The clerks who registered the birth of my two children and the recent marriage of an English guy, a friend, to a Ukrainian friend, were polite and considerate. They went out of their way to make things work when the documentation didn't all fall in place. They look at my children as integral to their future, and they want my children to succeed. Ukrainian citizens have to submit to the same kind of tests as citizens elsewhere. There are criterion-based tests. You have to qualify at a certain level in order to become a licensed driver, a teacher, or a lawyer. And there are competitive tests in which the various applicants all take the same test and the best are selected. In every testing situation, the only recognized criterion is how well the applicant does. It may not always go by the book. There can be bribes and other kinds of favors involved, but there is no government thumb on the scales favoring person A over person B on the basis of any personal characteristics. Ukraine is reminiscent of America in the 1950s. Material wealth is several times lower than in today's West. A family usually doesn't have more than one car and is lucky to own their own apartment. Although Ukrainians enjoy universal health care and pensions, both are very moderately funded and not that great. So people have to be responsible for their own lives to a greater extent than in the West. There's vastly less government policy restricting their freedom in exercising that responsibility. Ukraine is thoroughly homogeneous. People live, work, and go to school with people just like themselves. In the 1950s, while America may not have been homogeneous at state and national levels, it was very much so at the local level. People lived among their own kind, and there was a generally high level of social capital. And the same remained largely true in Western Europe, although even then there were ominous numbers of former subjects immigrating to the erstwhile colonial powers. Ukraine and the Visegrad countries to the west have remained homogeneous, even as the situation has changed rather radically in the West. Though we are materially quite a bit poorer than the West, a legacy of the mismanagement and corruption endemic in communism and the Tsarist empire that came before, we remain pretty high in mutual trust and appreciation. Chief among the factors that make this such a pleasant place to live, even given the corruption and lack of money, is the one that has not been stated by name within this article. Race. There is only one race here. The text of this piece is on my LiveJournal site. This is Graham Seibert signing off again from Kiev.